polished leather of the steering wheel felt cool and unforgiving beneath Ethan's hands. His knuckles were mountains of white, the only outward sign of the storm brewing within him. In the back of the cavernous luxury sedan, a world away from the driver's seat, laughter pealed, sharp, bright, and cruel. It was the sound of people who had never known a day of consequence, the sound of casual disregard that cut deeper than any deliberate insult. "Did you see his face, darling?" Eleanor Harrison's voice was a silken blade. "I think he actually thought you were speaking to him." Her husband Richard chuckled, a low, guttural sound of pure arrogance. "He's paid to drive, Eleanor, not to think. It's best for everyone if he remembers that." Their daughter, Amelia, a perfect, poisonous flower blooming in the rich soil of her parents' wealth, added her own flourish. "He probably lives in some dreadful little apartment and counts his pennies for gasoline. Honestly, Daddy, can't we get a driver who at least looks like he belongs in a car like this?" Ethan's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. He saw them reflected there. Richard with his smug, overfed face and eyes that held the flat, predatory gleam of a shark. Eleanor, her beauty a hard, polished mask that couldn't quite conceal the bitter emptiness behind it. And Amelia, her youth twisted into a caricature of condescension. They were a portrait of privilege, confident in their castle of glass and steel, utterly blind to the world outside their perfumed bubble. They thought he was just Ethan Cole, the quiet, unassuming driver, a cog in the machine, a nobody. They didn't know his real name was Ethan Vance. They didn't know the company that paid Richard's exorbitant salary, the company that afforded them this car, this house, this life of careless cruelty, was his. They didn't know that in precisely 87 days, the probationary year stipulated in his father's will would end, and the entire multi-billion-dollar empire of Vance Enterprises would fall under his complete control. They laughed at the poor driver, but they had no idea they were sitting in the back of their own judgment, being chauffeured directly toward their day of reckoning. Hey everyone, it's great to have you here for this story. If you can already feel the tension building and you're rooting for a little bit of justice, do me a favor and tap that like button. It really helps the story reach more people. And if you want to make sure you're here for the moment everything changes, hit subscribe and ring that bell. I love seeing where you all are watching from, so drop your city or country in the comments below. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. All right, let's get back to it. The road is about to get very, very bumpy for the Harrisons. The day Ethan was assigned to the Harrisons felt, in retrospect, like a calculated move by the universe, a test of the very principles his father had tried to instill in him. Jonathan Vance had been a man who could command a boardroom of hostile executives with the same quiet dignity he used to speak to the janitorial staff. "True strength, Ethan," he'd often say, his large, calloused hand resting on his son's shoulder, "isn't about how high you can climb. It's about how many people you can lift up with you. It's about remembering that the person cleaning your office has a name, a family, a story as important as your own." After his father's sudden passing, the board of Vance Enterprises, a collection of men and women who had revered Jonathan, were shocked by the will's codicil. For 1 year, his only son and heir, Ethan, was to work within the company under an assumed name in a non-executive role. He was to receive no special treatment, no access to his inheritance beyond a modest living stipend. He was to live and work as one of the thousands of employees who formed the foundation of the Vance empire. Only one board member, the steadfast and loyal Arthur Albright, his father's oldest friend, would know his true identity and act as his secret liaison. "Your father believed a king who has never walked among his people cannot rule them justly," Arthur had explained, his eyes misty as he handed Ethan the keys to a simple sedan and a set of uniforms. "He wanted you to see the company not from the top floor, but from the ground up. He wanted you to understand its heart before you became its head." So, Ethan Vance, graduate of one of the world's top business schools, fluent in 3 languages, and a brilliant strategist in his own right, became Ethan Cole, driver. His first few weeks were a blur of airport runs and cross-town meetings for various mid-level managers. They were polite, professional, and largely anonymous. Then came the assignment memo: permanent assignment, executive chauffeuring, client, Richard Harrison, CEO. Ethan had known of Richard Harrison, of course. His father had appointed him CEO 5 years prior, seeing a sharp, albeit ruthless ambition in him that he thought could drive the company's next phase of growth. "He's a shark, Ethan," Jonathan had once admitted over a game of chess. "And sometimes you need a shark to guard the reef. But you must never forget that a shark is always a shark. It only understands hunger." The first time he pulled up to the Harrisons' sprawling, neoclassical mansion, it was Amelia who greeted him. Or rather, she acknowledged his presence with the same enthusiasm one might grant a garden gnome. She was on the phone, pacing the marble steps, her voice a high-pitched whine of complaint. "I know, but he's making me go to the gallery opening. It's all so boring. Just a bunch of old people trying to pretend they understand art." She gestured impatiently at the car. "Ugh, finally, the new driver's here. I don't know, he looks plain. Hold on." She clicked the phone off and fixed Ethan with a dismissive gaze. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue, swept over his simple, clean uniform, his polished but inexpensive shoes, and the humble sedan he was driving. A stark contrast to the lineup of European sports cars gleaming in the multi-car garage. "You're the new driver?" she asked, the question itself an accusation. "Yes, miss, Ethan Cole," he replied, his voice even and calm. "Right. Well, my mother and father will be out in a moment. Don't just sit there, get the door," she commanded before turning her back and resuming her phone call as if he had ceased to exist. Ethan took a slow, steadying breath. This was the mission. This was the lesson. He got out, walked around the car, and opened the rear passenger door, standing silently as he waited. A few minutes later, Richard and Eleanor emerged. Richard was barking orders into his own phone, a Bluetooth device blinking in his ear like a malevolent blue eye. Eleanor glided down the steps, a cloud of expensive perfume preceding her. She didn't look at Ethan, her gaze fixed somewhere over his shoulder, as if he were a particularly uninteresting part of the scenery. They settled into the back seat. The door was still open. Ethan waited. Richard finished his call with a clipped, "Make it happen," and finally looked toward the front. "Well, what are you waiting for? An invitation?" he snapped. "Close the door and drive. We're late." Ethan closed the door gently. He walked back to the driver's side, the image of his father's warm, smiling face flashing in his mind. Walk among the people, Ethan. Understand the heart of the company. He slid behind the wheel, adjusted his mirror, and saw the three of them already engrossed in their own world, utterly oblivious to the man in the front seat. The man who owned the car they were in, the house they had just left, and the very air of importance they breathed. The first day had begun. 86 more to go. The weeks that followed settled into a grim, predictable pattern. The Harrisons treated Ethan less like a human being and more like a piece of sophisticated machinery, an extension of the car itself. They spoke in front of him as if he were deaf, discussing everything from Richard's brutal corporate strategies to Eleanor's complaints about the caterers for her next charity gala, to Amelia's romantic entanglements. They were unguarded, not because they trusted him, but because he didn't register as a person worthy of their caution. He was furniture. One Tuesday afternoon, a persistent, dreary rain fell from a sky the color of wet cement. Ethan had been instructed to pick Amelia up from a boutique in the city's most exclusive shopping district. He arrived 10 minutes early, as was his habit, and texted her to let her know he was waiting. The reply came back instantly. "Wait there. I'm not done." An hour passed. The rain intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm on the roof of the sedan. Ethan watched shoppers scurry under awnings, their faces tight against the weather. He read a chapter of a book on his phone, a dense text on sustainable urban development, a subject he was passionate about. Another hour crawled by. He called the house, thinking perhaps there had been a miscommunication. The housekeeper informed him that Mrs. Harrison had instructed her not to disturb Amelia while she was with her friends. Finally, after nearly 3 hours, his phone buzzed. It was Amelia. "I'm at the cafe next door. I bought a new coat and the bag is huge. Come in and get it for me." The request was dripping with entitlement, but it was the tone that grated. It was a command to a servant, not a request to a fellow human being. Still, he maintained his composure. "Miss Harrison, the car is in a no-standing zone. I can't leave it unattended." A sigh of extreme exasperation crackled through the phone. "Oh, for heaven's sake! Fine. I'm coming out. Bring an umbrella. My hair will get ruined." Ethan got out, the large company umbrella blooming open with a soft whoosh. He stood by the passenger door, the cold rain seeping into the cuffs of his trousers. A moment later, Amelia and two of her friends burst out of the cafe laughing. Amelia wasn't carrying a large bag. She was carrying a small, purse-sized one. The story about the coat had been a lie. She'd simply made him wait. She saw him standing there, holding the umbrella, a silent, solitary figure in the downpour. She smirked at her friends. "See? Just like a little butler," she said, her voice loud enough for him to hear clearly. Her friends tittered. She sauntered over, deliberately taking her time, and stopped just out of the umbrella's protective circle. "You're getting soaked," she observed with mock concern. "You should be more careful." She then made a show of looking at her own pristine designer shoes. "Ugh, puddles. I can't possibly walk through that." She pointed to a large puddle that had formed between her and the car door. "You'll have to, I don't know, do something." Ethan looked at the puddle, then at her smug, expectant face. For a fleeting moment, he imagined striding back to the car, getting in, and driving away, leaving her standing there in the rain. The fantasy was sweet, but it was just that, a fantasy. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Patience, Ethan. True strength is control." Without a word, he took off his driver's jacket. It was a high-quality, water-resistant material, but it was still his jacket. He folded it carefully and placed it over the deepest part of the puddle, creating a makeshift bridge. The fabric, dark and clean, immediately began to soak up the grimy water. Amelia's eyes widened in genuine surprise, which quickly morphed into triumphant glee. She looked at her friends, who were now watching with open-mouthed amusement. This was better than she could have imagined. "Well, look at that," she chirped. "How very chivalrous. Sir Walter Raleigh lives." She stepped delicately onto the jacket, her expensive heel grinding the fabric into the asphalt, and slid into the back seat. Her friends followed, giggling uncontrollably. Ethan picked up his ruined jacket. It was heavy with cold, dirty water. He laid it on the floor of the passenger side, a sodden testament to his humiliation. As he got back into the driver's seat, the smell of wet wool and rain filled the car. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Amelia was typing furiously on her phone, a wide, satisfied smile on her face. "You will not believe what the driver just did," she was texting. "Best day ever." Ethan's jaw was a granite ledge. He put the car in drive. The rain continued to fall. In his pocket, his fingers found the familiar, worn leather of the keychain his father had given him. He gripped it tightly. The simple, embossed V felt like a brand against his skin. It was a reminder of who he was, and a promise of what was to come. The humiliation was a currency, he realized, and he was letting them spend it all. He was letting them run up a debt they could never possibly repay. The incident with the jacket became a favored story in the Harrison household, a piece of family lore trotted out at dinner parties to illustrate the amusing lengths the staff would go to. Ethan bore the retelling with the same stoic calm he bore everything else. But each time he heard it, another small, cold stone was added to the wall he was building inside himself. Richard, for his part, seemed to take his daughter's casual cruelty as a challenge to invent his own forms of petty dominance. He began using Ethan as a personal assistant, a gopher, a silent witness to his own self-importance. The tasks were always just outside the bounds of his job description, designed to demean. "Cole!" Richard barked one morning, tossing a small, crumpled ticket onto the passenger seat. "This is for my wife's watch. It's ready. The jeweler is on the other side of town. Pick it up on your lunch break." "Sir, my lunch break is 30 minutes. With traffic, that's not possible," Ethan stated, his tone respectful but firm. Richard turned his head slowly, fixing Ethan with a look of profound disappointment, as if he were a particularly stupid dog that had failed to learn a simple trick. "That sounds like a personal problem, Cole, not a company one. You're a driver. Drive faster. Don't come back without it." Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded. He drove Richard to the Vance Enterprises Tower, a gleaming spire of glass and steel that bore his family's name. As Richard swept into the lobby, greeting people with the magnanimous air of a king, Ethan was left on the curb. He looked at the watch ticket. He could have refused. He could have called Arthur Albright and put an end to this farce right now. But that would be an admission of defeat. It would mean the lesson had been too hard, the test too severe. Instead, he drove. He navigated the snarling city traffic, his mind a cool, efficient calculator of routes and times. He found the jeweler, a small, exclusive shop tucked away on a quiet street. The watch was an extravagant, diamond-encrusted monstrosity. The jeweler, an old man with kind eyes, placed it in a velvet box. "This is a magnificent piece," the jeweler said. "Mrs. Harrison is a lucky woman." "Indeed," Ethan replied, his voice neutral. He made it back to the tower with 2 minutes to spare before he was scheduled to pick Richard up. He hadn't eaten. His stomach rumbled in protest. He ignored it. He parked in the designated spot and waited. And waited. An hour after the scheduled pickup time, his phone rang. It was Richard's secretary. "Mr. Harrison's meeting is running long. He's decided to have lunch with the partners. He'll be another 2 hours." 2 hours later, another call. "Plans have changed. Mr. Harrison is going straight to his club for a round of golf. He'll take a cab from there. He says you can go home." Ethan sat in the car, the engine silent, the afternoon sun slanting through the windshield. Richard hadn't even bothered to tell him himself. He had made him rush across town, skip his lunch, and then wait for hours, only to be dismissed via a subordinate. It wasn't about the watch. It was never about the task. It was about power. It was about demonstrating that Richard's time was infinitely valuable, and Ethan's was worth nothing at all. He looked at the velvet box on the seat beside him. He could drive it to the Harrisons' home. Or he could hold on to it. He could make Richard ask for it. It would be a small act of rebellion, a tiny shift in the power dynamic. He started the car and drove not toward the Harrison mansion, but toward his own small, quiet apartment on the other side of town. As he drove, he made a call. "Arthur," he said when his father's friend picked up. "It's me." "Ethan, is everything all right?" Arthur's voice was warm with concern. "Everything is proceeding as planned," Ethan said, a new hard edge to his voice. "I need you to do something for me. I need the last 5 years of executive expense reports for Richard Harrison. I also want a full breakdown of the discretionary budget for the CEO's office. And I want it delivered to my personal email by morning." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "May I ask why?" Ethan pulled up to his apartment building, a modest, well-kept brick structure. "Let's just say I'm taking my father's advice. I'm learning the company from the ground up, and I'm starting to suspect that some parts of the foundation are rotten." That night in his small, sparsely furnished apartment, Ethan didn't sleep. The velvet box with Eleanor Harrison's watch sat on his kitchen counter, a glittering symbol of the world he was temporarily excluded from. But on his laptop screen was something far more valuable. Page after page of expense reports, a litany of lavish dinners, first-class flights for non-business-related trips, consulting fees paid to vaguely named corporations, and charges from luxury boutiques that corresponded with Eleanor and Amelia's social calendar. It was all there, in black and white. Richard Harrison wasn't just a bully, he was a thief. He was using Vance Enterprises as his personal piggy bank. And as Ethan cross-referenced dates and amounts, a cold, clear picture began to form. Richard wasn't just skimming, he was systematically draining funds through a network of shell companies and inflated invoices. The arrogance Ethan saw every day was not just a personality flaw, it was the cover for a deep and pervasive corruption. He leaned back, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. The humiliation he felt in the car each day was a personal insult. This, however, was an insult to his father's legacy. This was a betrayal of every employee who worked an honest day for an honest wage. The game had changed. This was no longer just about enduring his probationary year. This was about saving the company from the man who was supposed to be leading it. The next morning, when he arrived at the Harrison mansion, Richard was waiting for him on the steps, his face a thundercloud. "Where is my wife's watch?" he demanded, foregoing any greeting. "It's safe, sir," Ethan replied calmly, his hands resting on the steering wheel. "It's safe? It's a $50,000 piece of jewelry. It's not supposed to be safe in your dingy apartment. It's supposed to be here. You had one job, Cole." "My job is to be your driver, sir," Ethan said, his voice dropping into a quiet, unnervingly calm register. "My job description does not include being a personal courier for your family's luxury goods on my own unpaid time. However, I did retrieve the watch as you demanded. I will deliver it to Mrs. Harrison, personally, at the end of my shift today." Richard was momentarily stunned into silence. This was not the response he expected. He expected apologies, groveling, fear. He did not expect calm, logical defiance. "Are you talking back to me?" Richard sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "No, sir, I'm clarifying the terms of my employment," Ethan said, looking Richard directly in the eye for the first time that morning. "Now, are we going to the office, or would you like to continue this discussion on your front steps?" For a moment, the two men were locked in a silent battle of wills. Richard, the powerful CEO, accustomed to absolute obedience. Ethan, the humble driver, armed with a newfound and dangerous knowledge. It was Richard who broke first. He could fire the driver, of course, but there was something in the man's eyes, a cool, unshakable confidence that gave him pause. It was unsettling. "Get in the car," Richard snarled, yanking the back door open himself. The small victory was Ethan's, but he knew it had come at a cost. He had marked himself. He was no longer just furniture. He was an irritant, a problem to be solved. And Richard Harrison was a man who solved problems, usually by making them disappear. The atmosphere in the car, once merely dismissive, was now thick with a palpable hostility. The Harrisons no longer ignored him. They targeted him. Their verbal barbs became more pointed, their demands more unreasonable. Eleanor would complain about the temperature, the music, the scent of the air freshener, anything to register her displeasure. Amelia took to leaving trash in the back seat, empty latte cups, crumpled napkins, shopping bags, as if the car were her personal wastebasket. Ethan cleaned it all without complaint. He absorbed their petty aggressions with an unnerving placidity. On the outside, he was the perfect, stoic employee. On the inside, he was a detective, an auditor, a strategist. Every insult was a piece of data. Every overheard conversation was a clue. He was building a case, not just for a courtroom, but for the court of his own conscience. The focal point of Richard's ambition, Ethan soon learned, was a project codenamed Phoenix. From the snippets of conversation he pieced together, Phoenix was a plan to sell off the company's oldest and least profitable division, Vance Industrial Manufacturing. It was the division his grandfather had started in a small garage, the one his father had always protected, not for its financial return, but for its symbolic value. It employed over 500 people in a small town upstate, many of whom were second or third generation employees. It was the heart of the company's origin story. To Richard, it was just dead weight. It's a sentimental relic, he'd fumed to an associate on the phone one afternoon, believing Ethan was deaf to his words. Jonathan kept it around like some sort of museum piece. It's dragging down our quarterly reports. I sell it off, we get a massive cash injection, the stock price soars, and our bonuses will be astronomical. It's a win-win. What about the employees? The associate had asked. Richard had scoffed. They'll get severance. It's the cost of progress. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Listening in the front seat, Ethan felt a cold fury unlike anything he had ever known. These weren't eggs. They were lives. They were families. They were the people his father had felt a profound duty to protect. Richard wasn't just stealing money. He was planning to gut the very soul of the company for his own personal gain. This was the final piece of the puzzle. This was the line that could not be crossed. The date for the annual board meeting, where Richard planned to officially present Project Phoenix for approval, was set for 3 weeks from now. Ethan's one-year probation ended in 2. The timeline was impossibly tight. The culmination of the Harrisons' campaign of humiliation came, as if scripted by a playwright with a taste for irony, at the family's annual pre-gala charity fundraiser. It was the social event of the season, a lavish affair held at their mansion, attended by the city's most powerful and influential figures, and Ethan was given a special role. "Cole," Richard had said, a malicious glint in his eye, "tonight we'll need you to help with the valet service. You know cars, after all." It was a public demotion, a deliberate act of degradation. He wouldn't be a chauffeur, he would be a parking attendant. He would be on display for Richard's peers, a living testament to Harrison's power to command and control even the smallest aspects of his world. Ethan simply nodded. "Of course, sir." That evening, dressed in a simple black jacket provided by the valet company, Ethan stood at the end of the long, winding driveway as a parade of Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and Ferraris disgorged their glittering occupants. He took the keys, offered a polite, "Good evening, enjoy the party," and drove the expensive machines to the designated parking area. He saw them all arrive: the mayor, the banking tycoons, the society doyens, and the members of the Vance Enterprises board, the men and women whose votes Richard was so confident he had secured. They swept past him without a second glance, their laughter and chatter floating in the cool night air. The Harrisons stood on their brightly lit portico greeting their guests. Richard was in his element, expansive and charming. Eleanor was a vision in emerald silk, a gracious queen surveying her court. And Amelia, dazzling in designer couture, moved through the crowd like a princess. At one point, as Ethan was bringing a car around, he overheard a conversation near the garden. It was Richard, speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone to 2 of the board members. "The votes are locked for Phoenix," Richard was saying. "It's a done deal. Once we shed the dead weight of the manufacturing division, our stock will hit the stratosphere. I'm talking a 20% jump, minimum." "What about Albright?" one of the board members, a man named Henderson, asked nervously. "He's always been sentimental about the old man's legacy." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Arthur is a relic, just like that factory. He'll make a passionate speech about loyalty and tradition. The board will nod politely, and then we will vote with our wallets. Don't worry, his one vote means nothing." Richard then turned, and his eyes landed on Ethan, who was standing by the open door of a guest car. A slow, cruel smile spread across Richard's face. He raised his champagne glass in a mock toast. "Gentlemen," Richard said, his voice loud enough to carry, "to the future, and to everyone knowing their proper place in it." The other men chuckled and turned to see what had amused him. They saw only a valet, a nameless face in the shadows. They turned back, oblivious. But Ethan had seen the look. He had heard the words. It was the purest expression of Richard's worldview. A world of masters and servants, of users and the used. Ethan closed the car door. He walked back toward the valet stand, his face an unreadable mask. But inside, the final wall had been built. The final stone was in place. The cold, quiet place in his heart was now complete. It was no longer a place of anger or hurt. It was a place of absolute clarity. He spent the rest of the night parking cars, a ghost at the edges of their glittering world. But he wasn't just parking cars. He was observing. He was listening. He was counting down the hours. The party was Richard's triumphant celebration. He was so sure of his victory. He was surrounded by his wealth, his power, his sycophants. He felt invincible. And that, Ethan knew, was the fatal flaw of every arrogant man. They never, ever looked down to see the ground crumbling beneath their feet. The 2 weeks leading up to the board meeting were a study in contrasts. For the Harrisons, it was a period of supreme confidence. Richard strode through the halls of Vance Enterprises with the swagger of a conquering hero. He was condescendingly gracious to his underlings, already practicing the largesse of a man who was about to become obscenely richer. Amelia was planning a celebratory trip to Europe. Eleanor was consulting with architects about expanding the ballroom. They were spending the profits from a betrayal that had not yet been formally committed. Their treatment of Ethan, if possible, grew even more dismissive. He was a relic of the old world, a soon-to-be-forgotten annoyance. They were ascending to a new stratosphere, and he was being left behind on the launch pad. They barely spoke to him, and when they did, it was with an air of finality, the way one speaks to a temp on his last day. For Ethan, these 2 weeks were the quietest, most intense period of his life. His days were spent in the silent, hostile cocoon of the sedan, absorbing the family's toxic atmosphere. But his nights were a whirlwind of activity. His small apartment transformed into a war room. The dining table was covered in spreadsheets, legal documents, and personnel files from the manufacturing division. He worked with a focus that was almost monastic in its intensity. He wasn't just looking for dirt on Richard anymore. He had more than enough of that. Now he was building something. With Arthur Albright's help, he was crafting an alternative to Project Phoenix. He named it Project Legacy. It wasn't a plan for retreat or nostalgia. It was a bold, forward-thinking strategy to revitalize the manufacturing division. He spent hours on video calls with engineering experts and supply chain specialists, people he knew from his university days, people who owed him favors. He mapped out a plan to retool the factory, to pivot from producing outdated industrial parts to manufacturing components for the green energy sector, a market Vance Enterprises had never touched. He analyzed the numbers, running projections until 3 in the morning. His plan required a significant initial investment, the kind of capital that would make a risk-averse board nervous. But the long-term projections were staggering. It wouldn't produce the immediate, dramatic stock jump Richard promised, but it would build a new, sustainable, and highly profitable revenue stream for the company for decades to come. It was a plan built on vision, not greed. It was the kind of plan his father would have made. During this time, he made one trip. He told the Harrisons he had a family emergency and needed 2 days off. He was met with annoyed sighs, but they grudgingly agreed, their minds already on their post-Phoenix future. Ethan didn't go to a hospital. He drove the 4 hours upstate to the small town of Northwood, the home of Vance Industrial Manufacturing. He didn't announce himself. He walked the streets, ate at the local diner, and talked to people. He told them he was a consultant doing a regional economic study. He heard their stories. He heard about how the factory was the lifeblood of the town, how it had put their kids through college, how the annual company picnic was the biggest event of the year. He also heard their fears. They'd heard the rumors. They knew a man like Richard Harrison saw them as a line item on a spreadsheet. He met the plant manager, a man named Dave, whose father had worked the same floor for 40 years. Dave showed him around the aging facility, his pride in his work and his people shining through his worry. "We're a good team here, Mr. Cole," Dave said, his voice thick with emotion. "We know some of this equipment is old, but the people are the best. They're loyal. They work hard. We just need a chance. We just need someone to believe in us." Ethan looked into the man's earnest, hopeful eyes. He saw the faces of the workers on the line, people who had given their lives to this company, to his family's company. This was not a museum piece. This was a living, breathing community. "I think," Ethan said, his voice quiet but certain, "you're going to get that chance." He drove back to the city with a renewed and unshakable resolve. The numbers on his spreadsheets now had names and faces. This was no longer an abstract business problem. It was a moral imperative. The day before the board meeting, he performed his last official act as Ethan Cole, driver. He drove the Harrisons to a final, celebratory dinner with their closest allies. The mood in the car was electric with anticipation. "To think," Eleanor said, clinking a glass of champagne Richard had brazenly opened in the back seat, "this time tomorrow, we'll be free of that dreadful old factory, and that much richer." "It's not just the money, darling," Richard said, his voice smug. "It's the principle. It's about clearing out the past to make way for the future. My future." Amelia, scrolling through pictures of Italian villas on her phone, sighed contentedly. "I've already picked out the perfect place for our summer house. It has a view of the sea." They didn't even notice when Ethan pulled up to the restaurant. He got out, opened the door, and they swept past him, a tidal wave of arrogance and expectation. Richard paused for a moment at the door. "Cole," he said almost as an afterthought, "don't bother waiting. Your services will no longer be required after today. The car service will send someone to pick up the vehicle in the morning. Human Resources will mail you your final check." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned and disappeared into the restaurant. Ethan stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. It was over. The year was done. He had been dismissed, fired. He looked at the gleaming sedan, the symbol of his servitude. He looked at the restaurant where the architects of his father's company's demise were celebrating their imminent victory. A slow smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of humor, but of profound, crystalline satisfaction. He didn't go home. He drove the sedan to the underground garage of the Vance Enterprises Tower. He took the private elevator using a key card that hadn't been touched in a year to a sub-level apartment his father had kept for late nights at the office. He showered, the grime and weariness of the past year washing away, and he put on the suit. It was a custom piece made by his father's tailor. A deep charcoal gray, perfectly cut, it was a suit that spoke of quiet authority, not flashy wealth. As he adjusted his tie, a simple silk navy blue, his father's favorite, he looked at his reflection. The face of Ethan Cole, the tired, put-upon driver, was gone. In its place was the face of Ethan Vance, a son who was about to honor his father's legacy. He picked up a slim leather portfolio from the table. Inside was Project Legacy, and in his pocket, his fingers closed around the familiar, worn leather of the keychain. The V felt warm against his skin. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. The main conference room at Vance Enterprises was on the top floor, a magnificent space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The table was a single, massive piece of polished mahogany, large enough to seat 20. At the head of it, In the chairman's seat that had remained symbolically empty for a year was Richard Harrison. He looked every inch the triumphant executive. His suit was sharp, his smile was wide, and his confidence radiated to every corner of the room. Eleanor and Amelia were not present, this was business, but their celebratory spirit seemed to linger in the air around him. The other board members were arranged along the table, a mix of allies, skeptics, and fence-sitters. The only empty chair belonged to Arthur Albright, who was, according to his assistant, running late. Richard was unconcerned. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice booming with manufactured bonhomie, "welcome. Today is a landmark day for Vance Enterprises, a day we finally turn the page on the past and write a bold new chapter for our future." He launched into his presentation for Project Phoenix. It was a slick, polished performance, full of corporate jargon and dazzling financial projections. He painted the manufacturing division as a cancer, a sentimental burden that was slowly killing the company. He spoke of the workers in Northwood not as people, but as redundant human capital and unavoidable restructuring casualties. He presented the sale as a surgical procedure, a necessary amputation to save the body. He clicked to his final slide, a graph showing a stock price arrow pointing vertically toward the heavens. "This, gentlemen, is not just growth. This is a paradigm shift. This is the future. I am asking for your vote to approve Project Phoenix and unleash the true potential of this company." He finished to a smattering of enthusiastic applause from his allies. The other members looked convinced, if a little uneasy. The sheer financial upside was hard to argue with. "A masterful presentation, Richard," said Henderson. "Truly." Richard beamed. "Thank you, Howard. Now, before we move to a formal vote, are there any questions?" He scanned the room, his eyes daring anyone to challenge him. The room was silent. His victory was complete. It was at that exact moment that the grand conference room doors swung open. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Arthur Albright, but he was not alone. Beside him stood a young man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He was calm, composed, and carried an air of authority that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. The board members stared, confused. Richard Harrison's smile faltered. He squinted, a flicker of an unfamiliar familiarity nagging at the edge of his consciousness. He'd seen that face before. But where? The valet? The driver? It was impossible. Arthur Albright stepped forward, his face grim and resolute. "My apologies for the delay, gentlemen. I was waiting for the arrival of someone whose presence is required before any vote can be taken." Richard found his voice, a strained, angry rasp. "Arthur, what is the meaning of this? This is a closed board meeting. Who is this man? Security!" But no one moved. All eyes were on the young man, who now took a step forward into the light. He looked directly at Richard, his gaze level and piercing. And in that moment, Richard knew. The face, stripped of the uniform and the posture of servitude, was suddenly shockingly familiar. It was the face from the photographs in the old annual reports, the face in the portrait that hung in the building's lobby next to his father's. It was the face of a younger Jonathan Vance. "There's no need for security, Richard," the young man said. His voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of command. It was the same voice that had said, "Yes, sir," and "Right away, sir," for a year, but now it was stripped of all deference. It was a voice of power. Arthur Albright cleared his throat, a sound that cut through the stunned silence. "Gentlemen of the board," he announced, his voice ringing with historic importance. "Allow me to formally introduce you. This is the man whose father's will you all ratified last year. The man who, as of midnight last night, has fulfilled the terms of his probationary period. Allow me to introduce the majority shareholder and the new chairman of the board of Vance Enterprises, Mr. Ethan Vance." The name landed in the room like a physical object. A collective gasp went around the table. Board members who had been slouching in their chairs sat bolt upright. Jaws literally dropped. Henderson, who had been so quick to praise Richard, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. And Richard Harrison simply stared, his face a mask of disbelief, his complexion shifting from tan to a pasty, sickly white. The world, as he knew it, had just tilted on its axis and thrown him into a cold, dark abyss. The driver, the valet, the boy he had dismissed, mocked, and humiliated. It was all a lie, a terrible, year-long, intricate lie, and he had walked right into the center of it. Ethan Vance walked calmly to the table. He didn't go to the empty seat next to Arthur. He walked directly to the head of the table, to the chairman's seat currently occupied by a frozen Richard Harrison. He placed his slim, leather portfolio on the polished mahogany. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Richard," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "You're in my seat." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a reality collapsing. Richard Harrison, the shark, the king of the castle, looked up at Ethan, and for the first time in his life, he looked small. He looked like prey. He slowly, mechanically pushed his chair back and stood up, stumbling slightly. He was a king without a throne, a captain without a ship, suddenly and irrevocably adrift. Ethan slid into the chairman's seat. It fit perfectly. He looked around the table, his eyes meeting those of each board member in turn. He saw fear, confusion, and in Arthur Albright's case, a deep and profound pride. "Good morning, gentlemen," Ethan said, his voice as smooth and cool as the polished wood beneath his hands. "My apologies for the interruption. Please, continue. I believe you were about to vote on the future of my company." The theatricality of the moment was not lost on anyone. The phrase, "my company," hung in the air, a final, indisputable declaration of the New World Order. Richard, still standing awkwardly to the side, looked like he was going to be sick. Ethan opened his portfolio. "Before you cast that vote, however, I believe there is a competing proposal that deserves your consideration." He gestured to Arthur, who began distributing copies of a document to the stunned board members. The cover page read, in simple, elegant font, "Project Legacy, a vision for the future of Vance Industrial Manufacturing." Project Phoenix, as Mr. Harrison has so slickly presented it, is a plan born of cowardice and greed, Ethan began, his voice gaining strength and passion. "It is a plan to sell our history for a quick profit. It is a plan to betray 500 loyal employees and devastate a community that depends on us. It is, in short, a plan that my father would have been ashamed of." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He then looked directly at Richard. "But it is also a plan based on a lie. The lie that Vance Industrial is a relic. The lie that it has no future." For the next 20 minutes, Ethan laid out his vision. He spoke not with Richard's empty bluster, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had done his homework. He spoke of retooling the factory, of entering the green energy market, of federal grants available for such conversions. He presented spreadsheets, market analysis, and letters of intent from potential partners he had already secured. He transformed the narrative from one of managing decline to one of seizing opportunity. He painted a picture not of a quick, fleeting stock bump, but of long-term, sustainable, and ethical growth. When he was finished, there was no applause. There was a deep, respectful silence. The board members were looking at him with a mixture of awe and dawning realization. They were not just looking at Jonathan Vance's son. They were looking at a leader. "This," one of the more skeptical board members, a man named Clark, said, looking up from the proposal, "This is brilliant. The numbers they're aggressive, but they're sound. Why weren't we shown this before?" Ethan's gaze, cold as a winter sea, settled once again on Richard Harrison. Because Mr. Harrison was not interested in building. He was only interested in selling. Because this plan requires vision, patience, and a belief in our people. Mr. Harrison, I'm afraid, is deficient in all three. The directness of the attack was breathtaking. This wasn't business, this was an execution. Now, Ethan continued, his voice dropping again to that quiet, dangerous level. Before we vote on Project Legacy, there is another matter of business to attend to. The matter of Mr. Harrison's leadership. He slid a single sheet of paper out of his portfolio. For the past year, I have had the unique opportunity to observe Mr. Harrison up close, not as a chairman, but as his driver. I've learned a great deal. He began to speak, and as he did, he cataloged the year of petty cruelties and grand betrayals. He did not speak with anger or self-pity. He spoke like an auditor presenting his findings. I learned that Mr. Harrison believes a man's worth is determined by his uniform. I learned that he thinks it's acceptable to make an employee wait for 3 hours in the rain as a form of amusement, he said, his eyes flicking toward the door as if he could see Amelia standing there. I learned that he believes company time and resources are his personal property, that a $50,000 watch is more important than an employee's lunch break, he continued, the memory of the cold car and his empty stomach still fresh. I learned that he will publicly humiliate an employee for sport, making him park cars at a party to demonstrate his own power, he said, the image of Richard's mocking toast burned into his mind. He let those personal grievances hang in the air for a moment, a testament to the character of the man standing trial. Then his tone shifted. It became even colder, more clinical. But those are minor character flaws, perhaps, annoying but not necessarily grounds for dismissal. What is more concerning is what I learned while he thought I wasn't listening. He tapped the sheet of paper. I learned that Mr. Harrison has been using a network of shell corporations, registered in his wife's maiden name, to bill this company for millions of dollars in fictitious consulting services. He slid another document across the table, a detailed flowchart of bank transfers and invoices. I learned that he has been expensing personal vacations, luxury goods for his family, and even his daughter's monthly clothing allowance as client development costs. He looked around the table. The board members were staring at the documents, their faces a mixture of horror and fury. They were businessmen. They could forgive a lot of things, but they could not forgive being played for fools. Ethan stood up, his full height seeming to diminish Richard even further. Project Phoenix was never about the company's future. It was about a massive, one-time cash injection. A cash injection Mr. Harrison planned to use to cover the tracks of his embezzlement before a real audit could ever uncover it. He wasn't selling a division. He was robbing the bank and trying to burn it down on his way out. He looked at Richard, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure terror. The bluster, the arrogance, the confidence, it had all evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, pathetic shell of a man. Richard Harrison, Ethan said, his voice now a final judgment. You are a thief, a bully, and a man devoid of honor. You have betrayed my father's trust. You have betrayed this board, and you have betrayed every single employee of this company. As of this moment, your employment with Vance Enterprises is terminated, for cause. He paused. Security, he said, his voice now carrying the effortless command of his new station, will escort you from the building. Your personal effects will be forwarded to you. Your assets, however, will be frozen pending a full forensic audit and likely criminal charges. I believe the term you used was a paradigm shift. 2 uniformed security guards, who had been waiting discreetly outside, entered the room. They moved toward Richard, their faces impassive. Richard seemed to shrink, his expensive suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say. He had been so thoroughly, so completely dismantled, there were no arguments left to make. As the guards led him away, a broken and defeated man, his eyes met Ethan's one last time. In them, Ethan saw not hatred, but a dawning, horrifying understanding. The driver he had never truly seen had seen everything. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the Harrison family. The news of Richard's termination for fraud spread through the city's elite circles like a wildfire. The name that had once opened every door was now a synonym for disgrace. They were social pariahs overnight. Eleanor and Amelia were at lunch, finalizing the details of their celebratory European tour when the first call came. It was from the club, politely informing Eleanor that her membership had been suspended. Then her phone buzzed with a text from the bank. The corporate credit cards she and Amelia used with such abandon had been declined. Confusion turned to panic. Eleanor called Richard's office, but his secretary, her voice cold and distant, informed her that Mr. Harrison was no longer with the company and could not be reached. It was Amelia, frantically scrolling through a gossip blog on her phone, who found the first whispers of the truth. CEO of Vance Enterprises fired in dramatic board meeting coup led by secret heir. They rushed home, but their key fobs no longer worked on the gate. A polite but firm security guard, a man they had never seen before, informed them that this was company property and they were no longer permitted on the premises. They were, he explained, allowed to schedule a time to retrieve their personal belongings under supervision. The life they knew had evaporated in the space of a few hours. The mansion, the cars, the accounts, the status, it was all gone. It had never really been theirs. It was all a perk of a job Richard had lost in the most spectacular way imaginable. They finally found Richard late that night, sitting in a rented sedan outside a drab airport hotel. He looked 10 years older. The swagger was gone, replaced by a deep, weary slump in his shoulders. "What happened?" Eleanor demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. Richard just stared blankly at the dashboard. "He was the driver," he whispered, the words sounding insane even to his own ears. "The whole time, he was the owner's son." Amelia began to cry, not out of sympathy, but out of a terrifying, selfish realization of what this meant for her. "The house? The money? My trip? It's gone," Richard said, his voice flat and dead. "All of it. He took it all." "He didn't take it, Richard," Eleanor finally shrieked, the polished mask of the society wife cracking to reveal the raw, desperate woman beneath. "You gave it away. You were so arrogant, so sure of yourself. You mocked him. You belittled him. Did you think there would be no consequences? You didn't just lose your job, you idiot. You lost everything for us." The argument that followed was bitter and raw, a post-mortem of a life built on a foundation of sand. The silent enabler was no longer silent. She had stood by and watched her husband's cruelty, enjoying its fruits. Now that the fruits were rotten, she turned on him with the ferocity of a cornered animal. It was an ugly, pathetic end to a partnership that had always been more of a merger than a marriage. Meanwhile, back at the Vance Enterprises tower, Ethan was just beginning. His first official act as chairman was to convene a company-wide video conference. Every employee, from the executives on the top floors to the maintenance staff in the basements, saw his face appear on their screens. He didn't mention Richard Harrison by name. He didn't gloat. He spoke of the future. He announced the immediate and permanent cancellation of Project Phoenix and the launch of Project Legacy. He announced a 10% bonus for every employee of Vance Industrial Manufacturing, a reward for their loyalty. He announced a new, company-wide profit-sharing initiative, ensuring that when the company did well, everyone did well. And then he told them a story. He told them about working for a year as one of them. He didn't name names or share specific humiliations. He spoke of what he had learned, that the true strength of the company wasn't in its stock price, but in its people. He spoke of his father's vision, a vision of corporate responsibility, of dignity, of community. "My father used to say that a company is a family," he concluded, his voice resonating with sincerity. For the last few years, I'm afraid we haven't been a very good one. That changes today. From now on, we will be a company built on respect. Respect for each other, respect for our customers, and respect for the communities we serve. My door is always open. My name is Ethan Vance, and it is the honor of my life to work with you. The response was overwhelming. A tidal wave of relief and renewed hope swept through the company. In the small town of Northwood, the factory floor erupted in cheers. Dave, the plant manager, gathered his team, his eyes filled with tears of joy. Their faith had been rewarded. Someone had believed in them. In the days that followed, Ethan worked tirelessly. He met with every department head. He walked the floors, shaking hands, learning names. He ate lunch in the company cafeteria, not as a stunt, but because he wanted to. He was dismantling the culture of fear and arrogance Richard had built, and replacing it with one of collaboration and respect. One afternoon, a week after the board meeting, his secretary informed him he had a visitor. "A Mrs. Harrison is here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment." Ethan paused. He could have refused. He had every right to. But he remembered his father's words about strength and lifting people up. "Send her in," he said. Eleanor Harrison entered his office. She was a different woman from the one he had chauffeured. Her designer clothes looked out of place. Her makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. The hardness was gone, replaced by a brittle fragility. She stood awkwardly in the center of the vast office. "Mr. Vance, Ethan," she began, her voice trembling. I came to apologize." Ethan remained seated, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "For what specifically, Mrs. Harrison?" he asked, his tone not unkind but not forgiving either. He needed to know if this was genuine or just another manipulation. "For everything," she whispered, sinking into the chair. "For the way we treated you, for the things I said, the things I didn't say. I stood by while we were cruel. There's no excuse. I was weak and I was a coward. I enjoyed the life his arrogance provided, and I never once thought about the cost." Tears began to stream down her face. "He was a bully, and I was his silent partner. I see that now." Ethan listened, his face unreadable. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she continued, fumbling in her purse for a tissue. "Richard is facing the consequences of his actions. Amelia is working as a waitress. It's been a shock for her, but I think it might be the best thing that ever happened to her. I just wanted you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry. You didn't deserve any of it." She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. For the first time, he saw a flicker of the person she might have been before she had encased herself in the armor of wealth and status. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Thank you for coming, Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time. "An apology doesn't change the past, but it can change the future. Your husband's crimes were his own. You and your daughter don't have to be defined by them." He took a business card from his desk and wrote a name and number on the back. "This is a friend of mine who runs a nonprofit that helps women re-enter the workforce. You have skills. You ran dozens of charity events. You're organized. You're resourceful. Perhaps it's time to use those skills for something other than yourself." Eleanor took the card, her hands shaking. She looked at it, then back at Ethan, a dawning hope in her eyes. "Why would you do this? After everything?" Ethan stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the city. "Because my father taught me that true wealth isn't about what you have, but what you can give. He also taught me that everyone deserves a chance to write a new chapter. Your husband's chapter is over. Yours is just beginning. What you do with it is up to you." Eleanor left his office a few moments later, not with the promise of her old life back, but with something far more valuable, a sliver of hope in a path toward redemption. Ethan had not been vengeful. He had been just. He had held up a mirror, and in doing so, had given her a chance to see herself and to change. The final resolution of Richard Harrison's affairs took months. The forensic audit uncovered a level of fraud that was even more extensive than Ethan had initially suspected. Faced with a mountain of evidence, Richard pleaded guilty to multiple counts of embezzlement and securities fraud. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The Harrison name, once a symbol of social triumph, was now a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Under Ethan's leadership, Vance Enterprises flourished. Project Legacy was a resounding success. The retooled Northwood factory became a model of modern manufacturing, profitable and innovative. The company's stock price didn't soar overnight, as Richard had promised, but it began a steady, inexorable climb, built on the solid foundation of real growth and renewed employee morale. Ethan Vance became a different kind of CEO. He was known for his sharp mind and his strategic vision, but also for his compassion and integrity. He was a living embodiment of his father's philosophy, proving that you could be successful without sacrificing your soul. One evening, a year after he had taken his seat at the head of the table, Ethan was working late in his office. The city lights twinkled below, a galaxy of human stories. On his desk, among the reports and contracts, lay a simple, worn leather keychain. He picked it up, the embossed V smooth under his thumb. He thought of the past 2 years, the humiliation, the anger, the quiet determination. He thought of the Harrisons, a family consumed by their own arrogance. He felt a pang, not of pity, but of a kind of sad understanding. They had been so blinded by their pursuit of status and wealth that they had lost the ability to see the simple humanity in the people around them. They had looked at him and seen only a uniform, a function, an object. They had never seen the man, and that blindness had been their undoing. His father's lesson had been a hard one, but it had been essential. He had walked among his people. He had felt the sting of disrespect and the weight of being invisible. He had seen the heart of the company, both its rotten parts and its strong, beating core. And he had emerged not bitter, but wise. He had learned that true power wasn't the ability to command or to crush, but the ability to build, to inspire, and to lift up. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life, a legacy far more valuable than the billions in his bank account. He put the keychain back in his pocket, a permanent reminder of where he had been and of the man he was determined to be. So what do you think? Is justice always this satisfying, or did Ethan show more grace than the Harrisons deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It's always fascinating to hear how you all feel about the moral choices these characters make. If this story of quiet strength and ultimate vindication resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more stories like this one. Your support truly means the world. Thank you for being here, and remember, true worth is never about the car you drive, but about the character of the person behind the wheel. Until next time.